Okay, today I'm going to do a lesson titled Lot's Wife by the Russian poetess Anna Akhmatova. Now, you have two poems prescribed to you by the same name, Lot's Wife. One is written by Anna Akhmatova and the other by Christine Beatty. Now, both these poems deal with the same theme, but both these women have dealt it in a very significant, distinctive manner, each one in her own style, right? So both these poems are titled Lot's Wife. There's no change in the name, but only thing, one is written by Anna Akhmatova and the other one is written by Christine Beatty. So today we are going to just look at Anna Akhmatova's poem, Lot's Wife. Now, before I pass on to the poem, I am sure you don't know much about Anna Akhmatova. Now, she was a Russian poetess who lived in the 19th century, 1889 to, and she died in 1966. So she's a very older generation poetess, right? And she lived during the period of Stalin in Russia. So she actually underwent a lot of troubles because of Stalin's autocratic regime. And she was one of the members of the Akhmatist movement, which was against Stalin's regime. So they were revolutionaries, right? So her poetry is usually, when we read her poems, we understand that her work is characterized by subtle understatements. There is like variations in rhythm, and there is this spontaneous recording of day-to-day emotions. And we understand that Anna Akhmatova's poetic diction and the psychological themes that she uses were drawn from the humanistic tradition of the 19th century Russian prose. When you read her poems, you can understand that her poems actually imitate the rhythm and structure of conversational speech. And I'm sure you must have heard of Boris Pasternak. Boris Pasternak was the writer, the novelist who wrote Dr. Zhivago, right? And she admired Boris Pasternak very much, and her work is, we can say, it's a kind of just like his, a very sincere response to the inhuman cruelties of that age. Her husband, her son, all of them had to face incarceration because of Stalin's regime. They kind of revolted against his regime, and as a result of that, they had to face imprisonment. And her husband was executed. So she actually went through a lot of problems during. I think problems would be an understatement. She actually went through a lot of mental harassment, physical harassment, everything during that particular period. And that is how she evolved as a writer, as a poetess. She has written a lot of poems, poems and works. Now, this work, Lot's Wife, was written in Russian. And what we are learning today is the translation by Richard Wilbur. And this is actually an old story. I'm sure all of you must have heard about the biblical story of Lot's wife turning into a pillar of salt, right? So this is the same story which we have seen passed down from generation to generation. But here, Anna Akhmatova narrates this story from a new perspective. Now, she narrates this from the perspective of Lot's wife. Now, what we have been reading in the Bible is about Lot fleeing Sodom and Gomorrah, running away, and God tells him, the angel of the Lord comes and tells him, you're supposed to flee and do not turn back. When you hear the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, because Sodom and Gomorrah were, they were called wicked cities, mainly because the main problem or the main crime which the people of Sodom and Gomorrah propagated was homosexuality. And the Bible says that homosexuality is abomination in God's eyes, right? So that was one reason why God decided to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he rained down sulfur from heaven, and that's how Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. But Lot was a just man, and he and his family were were allowed to escape. So the angel of the Lord comes and tells them to run away. But he gives them one instruction, that is, do not turn back. But unfortunately, what happens is Lot and his daughters run. His wife also runs, but when she hears the sound of the sulfur raining down, she turns back. And the biblical narration is that she turns into a pillar of salt, right? Now, this is the story. And the Genesis, this is in the book of Genesis of the Bible, and this is told practically without giving much insight into the emotions or thoughts of the people involved. So we don't know what Lot was thinking, what his wife was thinking. So it's like, a kind of historical document. And when we read the biblical story, we are given facts about what happened. But we don't get any idea about what did these characters feel. And especially in the biblical account, people say that Lot's wife is overlooked because she turns into a pillar of salt because she disobeys the commandment of God, and then she's never spoken of again. And this poem gives the reader an insight into what might have been going through the mind of this woman. She's even known as, like, we don't even know her name. She's known as Lot's wife, right? So this is what Anna Akhmatova is trying to bring out. What was going through the mind of this woman, right? And when you read the title itself, we understand that this is going to be a little different from the original story, because when we read the biblical account, it is Abraham and Sarah who are the central focus. Lot is Abraham's nephew, right? But we don't hear much about them, and especially after they moved to Sodom, and they never heard of it. It's kind of very forgotten, kind of. And it is until God comes and tells Abraham. See, God speaks to Abraham. And he tells that I'm going to destroy Sodom. And it is then that Abraham begs God to save the righteous from the city. You know, he keeps on interceding. He says, if there are 100 righteous men, 50 righteous men, 10 righteous men, will you save the city? And ultimately, God honors his request, and that is how Lot and his family are led to safety while the rest of the city burns. Yeah, but God had told them not to turn back and look. But Lot's wife disobeys the command, and she is instantly turned into a pillar of salt, right? So when we read this poem, or when we read about Lot, when we read the title of the poem, Lot's wife, we immediately feel that this is going to be from the feminist angle. And in the biblical account, she might be a casualty. We don't even know like what her name was. But in this poem by Anna Akhmatova, she is the central figure, right? So she is going to be the central focus. So this is what this poem is all about. So I'll just read the poem for you. You can just listen to me, and then we will discuss stanza by stanza. It's a very short poem, right? So it goes like this. This is a poem written in Russian by Anna Akhmatova, translated by Richard Wilbur. And this is actually a poem which portrays the pain of a person who is torn from his or her roots. So that is why, we get this poem titled Lot's Wife, because Anna Akhmatova is trying to identify with Lot's wife. So what could have been she feeling? Why did she actually turn back? This is what she's trying to analyze here. So I'll just read the poem for you. You can just listen to this. Lot's wife. The just man followed then his angel guide, where he strode on the black highway, hulking and bright. But a wild grief in his wife's bosom cried, look back, it is not too late for a last sight of the red towers of your native Sodom, the square where you once sang, the gardens you shall mourn, and the tall house with the empty windows where you loved your husband and your babes were born. She turned, and looking on the bitter view, her eyes were welded shut by mortal pain. Into transparent salt her body grew, and her quick feet were rooted in the plain. Who would waste tears upon her? Is she not the least of our losses, this unhappy wife? Yet in my heart she will not be forgot, for who for a single glance gave up her life. That's a poem. It's a very short poem. I'll just read it once more. It goes like this. The just man followed then his angel guide, where he strode on the black highway, hulking and bright. But a wild grief in his wife's bosom cried, "Look back, it is not too late for a last sight of the red towers of your native Sodom, the square where you once sang, the gardens you shall mourn, and the tall house with empty windows where you loved your husband and your babes were born." She turned, and looking on the bitter view, her eyes were welded shut by mortal pain. Into transparent salt her body grew, and her quick feet were rooted in the plain. Who would waste tears upon her? Is she not the least of our losses, this unhappy wife? Yet in my heart she will not be forgotten, who for a single glance gave up her life. So this is the poem, right? So in the first stanza, I think there are four stanzas, right? In the first stanza, we understand that the poem begins by aligning with the biblical account, because in that, see, Lot is called a just man and explains that he followed his angel guide. See, just man followed then his angel guide. So the speaker describes the angel as hulking and bright, right? So the use of the word hulking seems quite contradictory to the bright descriptions usually given for angels. It gives us the idea that the speaker is not necessarily siding with the angel, but the speaker does not blatantly disregard the angel, right? So that's why it says hulking is like, you don't use the word hulking for angel. Angels are always very majestic, angelic, bright. That's what we say. But here we see that the description is hulking. It is something, a kind of a contradiction to the descriptions usually given for angels. So we feel that here the writer is not very happy, or the speaker is not very, not on the side of the angel, right? But the speaker does not blatantly disregard the angel also. The speaker identifies very strongly with Lot's wife when she describes the wild grief in his wife's bosom cried. Right? So he's describing, she is describing the wild grief in her bosom. When we read the biblical account, we never would have thought about the sadness in the heart of Lot's wife as they left their home. But here, this poetess is bringing Lot's wife to life by allowing us to read her thoughts, right? See, it's written in italics. The thoughts of Lot are given in italics, and the speaker portrays them in such a manner that we are able to feel her pain. The speaker imagines that Lot's wife was filled with thoughts of her own life, as her home burned behind them. And she might have thought, look back, see, it's not too late for a last sight. And, she describes the city she once called home. So this is her pain, a woman, we always talk about men building houses and women building homes. Homes are actually houses brought to life by women. So for Lot's wife, her thoughts are given in italics, right? Because we feel her pain. It's just to show us her pain. And she is turning to look back for a last sight, and she is describing the city which she once called home. Because in the second stanza, she says like this, of the red towers of your last sight of the red towers of your native Sodom, the square where you once sang, the gardens you shall mourn, the tall house with empty windows where you loved your husband and your babes were born, right? So we are able to empathize with how Lot's wife would have felt when she left the house or left the home where she had built her life, she had a life with her husband there. They loved each other there. That is where the fruition of their love were born. That's their babies were born, right? So here we feel that the speaker is trying to bring sympathy in our hearts, right? So the speaker is like a third person, and the speaker is trying to, it's like, trying to create in the reader or create in us a kind of sympathy for Lot's wife, just talking about her home, like women would, talking about the square or the courtyard where she sang, the gardens which she had planted, the tall houses, the windows, like, everywhere she had sat. So all this is actually showing us how this woman would have felt about her home, and she's losing that home. So nobody's thinking about her. Everybody's thinking about the just man Lot. And from there, we continue into the third stanza where the poetess is trying to engage us or the reader in empathy for Lot's wife when she describes her decision to turn and look back, and that looking back, resulted in a bitter view. That's what she says. She turned, looking on the bitter view. Her eyes were welded shut by mortal pain. Anna Akhmatova is describing the eyes of Lot's wife as being welded shut by mortal pain, which makes us understand the pain this woman must have felt as she turned and looked at her old home burning. She saw her house burning, and she knew that this was the last sight that she would ever see. And that was also the last step she ever took. Because again, you see the poetess describing her feet being rooted in pain. That means the moment she turned, she was rooted in the plain. That is, her body became a pillar of salt. Her body became transparent salt, right? So she turns, the last sight, and that was the last step also. And from that, we move on to the fourth stanza. Who would waste tears upon her? In the final stanza, the poetess is taking a step back and asking a question. Who would waste tears upon her? Is she not the least of our losses? This unhappy wife. See, the poetess is aware that many people who have read the biblical account of Lot's wife would feel no compassion for Lot's wife. After all, she's a woman who disobeyed what God commanded, right? But the poetess, she says, yet in my heart she will not be forgotten, who for a single glance gave up her life. She sets herself apart from the rest, claiming that even if everyone looked on Lot's wife with scorn, with disgust, she would not. She says, I would always continue to think of Lot's wife with compassion in my heart, because she says she would always remember her fondly whenever she reads the story, because she feels that Lot's wife was a very sacrificial woman. She says for a single glance she gave up her life. This line emphasizes that Lot's wife was not a foolish woman, not a woman who was not able to control herself, but she was a woman who made a conscious decision to give up her life for one final glance at the place she once called home. So that is why Anna Akhmatova says, I admire her. So when you look at the historical context of this poem, as I told you about Anna Akhmatova, she was very much revered in Russia as an incredible poet, right? She was a person who lived through intense political persecution, see Stalin's totalitarian regime, war, and she was one person who criticized other Russians who fled Russia for their own safety. She says, I would never go do that. She chose to stay in Russia because she loved her country. She was loyal to her country. And this insight reveals the ways in which Anna Akhmatova may have sympathized with Lot's wife. So though she was not happy in the way her country was being governed by Stalin, she still loved her homeland. And it is very easy to say how she would identify with Lot's wife, as she was also a woman who was unwilling to leave her homeland even for her own safety, right? That's why she turns. So when others would read the story of Lot's wife and consider her a fool, Akhmatova wouldn't, because she says, I have experienced similar feelings and I am unwilling to leave my homeland for my own safety. So we can say that Anna Akhmatova's poem, Lot's Wife, is an interesting poem for several reasons. One, it contains a biblical theme, which is always interesting for feminist criticism because of the different ways in which women are depicted in the Bible, right? And here, Akhmatova's poem very interestingly subverts one of the common themes that arises when more traditional analysis of the Bible are used, right? So in the Bible, we see women tend to be very holy, pure, or sometimes very bad troublemakers, sometimes harlots, sometimes enemy spies, sometimes very, women who seduce men. So, different kinds. They tend to be on two different poles. And Lot's wife was one woman who came from this notoriously wicked city, which is mentioned in the Bible, right? That is Sodom, the sister city to Gomorrah, right? And uh, in the Bible, we don't see Lot's wife mentioned much. There's only one single line which states that she looked back and she was turned into a pillar of salt. But what Akhmatova says is, despite being present in a single sentence, this woman has captured the imagination of many poets. And she is punished in the Bible, right? And this marks her as another woman who did wrong, someone whom people are not expected to sympathize with, right? And this lack of ceremony attached to her death illustrates this well. She's quickly forgotten, and Lot does not mention her again. When you read the Bible, you don't see Lot mentioning her again. But Akhmatova is different. She exhibits a great sympathy with this woman, right? She feels that the fact of life being left behind in Sodom is brought up, and the contrast that is made at the beginning of the poem helps us to set the tone for the rest of the work. Lot is referred to the just man, angel as God's shining agent, going through a giant track, moving with a great purpose. In contrast to this masculine energy, determination, this woman, that is Lot's wife, is being harried by a restless voice. That's what we see in the first stanza, right? There's a restless voice, a wild grief. She's not very sure, and she does not move along as straight in a straight line, right? In contrast to the straightforward movement shown by the male figures in the poem, she is very still. She is imagining the domestic scenes. She sees it's a kind of mental wheel that goes, the marriage bed, where they made love, where the children were born, and they're very erratic, right? But Lot moves on. For him, these are not very important. He can move without these things. But for her, it's not that. She's not able to move. Uh, she is referred to as Lot's wife, right? And she is a woman with a lot of feminine sentiments, concerns, a traditionally feminine concern of her family home. Everything is there deep in her heart, and that is what drives her to look back. And remember, this is what she's punished for, right? And it's very interesting to note that Akhmatova states that Lot's wife is very insignificant in the biblical text. In fact, she does seem insignificant, but this is because female concerns and priorities were historically viewed as insignificant. So it is very difficult for Lot to see the domestic sphere as particularly important, because it was very easy for him to leave it. But for her, it wasn't that easy. For her, it was, a heartbreak. So when you look at the critical response to this poem, when you critically analyze this, we can summarize that this poem, it retells the story of the biblical account of a man and wife and their family who are all fleeing their hometown to escape God's wrath or God's anger. But when Akhmatova wrote her poem, instead of focusing on the plot, we were always reading about the plot, how Sodom and Gomorrah were wicked cities, how there was a lot of homosexuality, how when men came, the angels came to stay in Lot's house, the men, old and young, came and flocked around his home, asking him to send them out so that they could have sex with them. So, we focus more on the plot, and that is when the angels who had come to stay at Lot's house, they strike these men blind, and then they take Lot and leave, and they ask him to leave because they're going to destroy the. So we focus mostly on the plot. But Akhmatova does not focus on the plot. She pays special attention to Lot's wife. And it is the wife's emotional state that is being examined here. And that enables us to see the story in a very different light. So we understand, how much painful it is for Lot's wife to run from her home, because we read the word, see, wild grief. Look back. The wild grief cries, look back for a last sight. So we see this woman struggling with deciding whether to look back at her home or keep running. She's troubled, right? But she takes a decision to look back. And when she looks back, she contradicts God's instructions and her body turns into salt and she is destroyed with the city, right? But in the final stanza, we see Akhmatova prompting us to consider the significance of Lot's wife's death. She writes, who would waste tears upon her? Is she not the least of our losses, this unhappy wife? Yet in my heart she will not be forgotten, who for a single glance gave up her life. So thus in questioning the woman's death, Akhmatova is asking us whether the wife's actions were acceptable or reasonable. Although she disobeyed her husband and God by looking back at her hometown, why did she do that? She did that because she could not accept the fact that she had to leave her life behind. That is why Akhmatova says, I sympathize with the woman and I will never forget her. See, we have to examine this from the feminist perspective. Women are always so much connected to their homes. For them, their families, for them, their husbands, their children, the home that they have built is very, very important. And to leave that and run away is something which they find it very difficult to internalize. And on top of that, when you see the home that you have built so lovingly with your hands suddenly go up in flames, you cannot help but turn back and see and just at least, you won't forget about obedience. You might not remember about obedience. You might forget all that because for a woman, her heart is always where her home is. How much ever she does outside the home, whatever she does outside the home is not very significant as much as her home is. She might be a very, women might be great achievers in their career, in their careers, in the places where they work. But for her, for most women, I would say most women, true happiness and true joy is not derived from achieving great victory or great heights in their career, but in their homes. Because for them, their heart is always where their home is. For them, their husbands and their children and the home that they have built is very important. And it always holds a very special place in their heart. And they cannot easily let it go. And that is what happened to Lot's wife. So people would call her disobedient. People would call her foolish. But Anna Akhmatova says she wasn't. She was just being a woman. She was just looking at the home that she had built, right? So that is what this poem is all about. I hope you've understood. If you have any questions, you can now ask me.